That's right. We are jumping into troubleshooting methodology. Well, what's the first step? Find out next.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Now, Wes Bryan, the first step actually sounds obvious, but it is more difficult than we think at times
Sure.
to be able to actually identify the true problem. And the reason why, at least for me, is the only thing we tend to hear about is the symptom of
right.
what has happened. But our goal is to actually be able to identify the problem. So where do we begin?
Sure. You know, one of the things that we have to kind of state here is that when you're taking a CompTIA exam, their troubleshooting model is very, very important for the questions that you're going to get on the exam. Now, to give you a little bit of real-world advice, do you have to follow the CompTIA network troubleshooting model? Ronnie says yes. and the point is that we want to at least have a systematic approach to troubleshooting. So in the real world, if you decide, it's a very good model, but if you decide that maybe your company has one, that you always follow a system. All right, and like Ronnie said, we tend to see what the symptoms are before we ever even hear or can figure out what the problem is. So in the first step of the CompTIA network troubleshooting model, now those of you that are coming from A+, it's the same model, by the way, but if you're only taking Net Plus, then maybe this is new to you. We're going to be looking at these few steps when it comes to the troubleshooting model. All right, in identifying the problem, you will see that there are a series of sub-steps, and these are here. And we're going to talk about these each individually, and if you want to pause the video for a second and write these down, know the adjacencies of the ideas, because scenarios on the exam, they might put you at a certain step. Maybe it is identifying the problem. But then they want to know, do you know what the next step might be? And you're going to have to be very attentive, if you will, to the scenario. So let's go ahead and let's talk about the first step, right? The first portion of identifying the problem. And that's going to be gathering information. Gathering information is a very, very important process to help you identify what that problem might be. When we look at gathering information, you're going to want to know what is the current state of the network. And what does that mean for us? Is the LAN up? Is the local area network operational? Remember, we can use utilities like ping and stuff, and we can test if we have communications on the internal LAN. All right. Are there local services that are available? Again, we don't know. We rely on a lot of network services in order to have communications, and if these services fail, then we might have a problem there. Right? The other thing is things like the gateway. Is the gateway online? Can we communicate with the gateway? Things like, well, is there a WAN connection? Can we connect to the carrier network, or ISPs, if you will? So all of this is going to help us to establish what is the current state of our network.
Yeah, when it comes down to the idea of the current state of the network, that's actually kind of the hard thing, right? The very fact is you actually have to be able to isolate from that particular point. So Wes, once we actually get into that, what's our next step once we talk about this?
Well, a major portion of gathering that information, if you want to get some good information about what the state of the network is, go to the people that are actually using the product, if you will, services, the network themselves. Because remember, when you talk about end user feedback, that is going to be essential, because if you need immediate feedback on what the current state is, ask the people that are using it, right? Go to those that are directly using it so you can know what they're experiencing. And you have to remember that we need to ask the right questions. And one of the things that CompTIA is very, very particular on is asking these open-ended questions, right? Sometimes the questions might be yes or no, but for the most part, if you ask an open question, what are you currently seeing? All right, are you having issues? Well, yes. Well, that doesn't really give me a lot of information. So I could say something like this. Could you perform this task before? And if you've performed this task before, has anything changed? All right. If so, add this information. You might add some of this information still in your information gathering. So questioning the user is very, very important.
Yeah, this is where it comes back to some of the skills that we learned about during the time that we spent in school, right? Who, what, where, why, when, and how. These are questions that we should have when somebody is actually addressing those issues, because usually when we actually only lead to those yes or no's, as Wes has said, it doesn't really provide any more help for you. But if you can actually determine, well, who is experiencing this? Well, you definitely are, but you might be able to ask somebody maybe sitting in another cubicle, are you experiencing the same issues, since you're actually doing the same things? Either they are or they aren't. Well, that can, of course, lead you to be able to identify what the problem may be. It might not be at the end user workstation. It might be somewhere else centrally located. We then can explore why, and then we can explore how we can actually start doing that. But without trying to actually, come up with some magical questions here, stick with kind of the elementary school process that we actually learned about. And that will actually lead you to more fruitful discovery of being able to actually do this, especially when we're questioning the end user. All right, so Wes, once we actually do something like that, they're actually going to present to us a list of possible symptoms here. So once we actually do that, what do we actually take a look at when it comes to networking?
All right, so the next thing that we're going to do is, now this is where we usually see these before we can even identify the problem, right? And that's identifying what are the current symptoms, right? If we talk about symptoms, are the symptoms a network outage? Ronnie mentioned, is it a single user or is it more than one user, right? At a certain point, that's going to help us later in the troubleshooting process to scope the situation out. And I mean, scoping is not just viewing it, but saying, hey, is this company-wide? Is this a single user? Is it specific to a department that are within a certain location? Are services unavailable? Things like, for instance, are you having application issues, right? If we know that we're having application issues, that might actually give you the ability to do multiple approaches and say, oh, if this application's having a problem, for instance, maybe it's DNS, that might be a service issue as well, right? So identifying those symptoms is very important, and identifying messages like this over here that we see. Are there any error messages? And if so, let's discover what those error messages are telling us so that, again, we can gather more information.
Yeah, now, this is the one that frustrates me the most, especially on the idea of error messages, because I've seen it happen, and I know I've done it myself. An error message pops up, and I just go ahead and I click cancel
right through
and not even take a look.
Yeah.
So part of it's going to be end user training, that when somebody's actually going through, oh no, an error message pops up. What is it? I don't know. And then they try and show you, and they pop up, and because they're so used to clicking on it and making it go away, they just continue to do that. And like, all right, what I need you to do this time is to not click away from the error message until I can read it. And it sounds something silly, but at the same time, those error messages can really help us to see and identify what the issue might be. So a lot of times what we get now are questions in our forums, as well as even on social media a lot of times, and they're saying, hey, here's the error I'm experiencing, and that helps because it says unauthorized user or access denied. Well, I know access denied pretty much means it's a permission issue of some sort.
Definitely.
That helps.
Absolutely. So, and again, following that line of thinking, one of the videos that we did for helping end users support something known as the user state migration tool, the person was having an error, and they said, hey, it's a scan state or a load state error 27. Well, that instantly allowed me to check the Microsoft documentation and say, oh, this is the path to the store location of those settings, and that's what it was telling me. It was telling you that, hey, you need to figure out, are the permissions on the file share where you're storing those settings, are they set correctly? Do you have the path type correctly? So it does help us to quickly identify, rather than having to go down into event logs, device logs, which we can also still use too. So once we've identified the symptoms, now one of the big things to do is determine if things have changed. Now, you might have already determined this by asking those really good questions of your end users, right? Could you do this task before? Yes, I could. Okay, so you could do this task before. Has anything changed since now we see this problem? And again, it might not be something that their users are aware of. It could be on the back end and the actual network that's having an issue. So we're not poking at the end users themselves, right? Have we recently done a software installation, right? Have we done software updates? Software updates are known to break communications when you're working with network-aware applications, right? Has there been a reconfiguration of the network, right? Did we bring a new router online, right, for whatever reason, right? Is it something like maybe there's a host configuration, right? Now what I'm talking about is on the endpoint itself. Has something changed, right? Did we make a change to the firewall? Did we, on that host, did we do an operating system update that is now causing some kind of conflict with the communications and disrupting the workflow? Because, like we know, we want to do patches, but sometimes patches have been known to break things, whether it's firmware, if you will, or whether it's in your operating system itself.
Yeah, now, in a real-world scenario, here's a couple of things that also happens, especially with something like this, is that you may have an application that somebody is using as a client. In other words, they're accessing it, but it's connected to a server somewhere in the background, and what the client user may actually end up doing as they're working it starts popping up saying, hey, there's a new version available to you. And so what does the user think? It's got to be okay, right? It's a new version. It should be updated. Everything should be fine. And then they click on it, and all of a sudden they lose connection. And the reason why they might end up losing connection is that on the back end, the server that it's connecting to allow them to actually do the work, it's not updated. So you can experience issues like that. So you have to actually take some time to, when you actually do something like that, where you determine the changes, that application, is it connecting to something else that we actually also need to troubleshoot or need to ask about as well. Operating system updates. Usually a lot of times in big companies or medium to big companies, it will actually be where users are not allowed to actually do updates. But in a smaller company, if you're the only IT guy there, it may be that they just say, oh, yeah, my computer is ready for updates, and they just go ahead and update them. And that could cause things to break. So you want to make sure that you understand that there are these particular situations where you will find that realistic example, and it just kind of stares you in the face like, oh, did you update the computer? Yes, I did. Okay, well, that could be the actual issue then.
Absolutely, you might need to roll it back.
Right.
And one of the final things that they have in this step is they talk about making sure that you consider multiple approaches, which we've kind of already done. If you think about the fact that maybe somebody has an application, again, a network-aware application that isn't functioning properly. All right, so that's a symptom, but is it a DNS issue in the back, not doing name resolution? Do we have a DHCP service that's offline? Do we have a lease that's expired and person can't communicate with the DHCP server, right? And if so, is that something that's on the server side? Is it on the client side? Let's check both. Again, do not just stop with one potential issue. It could be more than one problem, right? Application issues like we've talked about, network issues, and again, it could be both, right? Things like the client-side issues. Network issues and client-side issues, like Ronnie said, they might go hand in hand. Other things too, like for instance, service issues. Remember, don't just stop with a single thing. When you're identifying a problem, you might have something that's a little bit more complex, and it might be more than one issue that's causing that problem.
Wes, this is where learning about the OSI model is really helpful, because as you begin to troubleshoot, even if you're using this model, to be able during this step that Wes is talking about, to go through the OSI model and say, did I actually address this so that the computer, the user, the network, all these functions are actually doing everything that they need to ensure that that user is going to be able to get access to the things that they need. So the weird thing about this, Wes, is that sometimes everything could be working, but it's just not working optimally.
That's
like
right.
Something is actually not happening, and that becomes a little bit more difficult. But by starting off with these steps, it really does help. So Wes, any last pieces of advice?
No, that's it. Again, just from multiple approaches. Again, keep in mind it's okay to be wrong as well. And if you need to gather more information, remember it can be a cyclic process where maybe you have to back up a few steps and you have to, a few steps back, few steps forward, right? As they say, and you should be doing good.
All right, that is pretty much it for the idea here of identifying the actual problem, but also, of course, using a particular methodology to help us out, and this will be the CompTIA Network Plus methodology that we were focusing on. But there's plenty of more steps for us to go through, and we'll find out about them in the next episode.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.